Hello, welcome to Chapter 10, Micro Lecture number 2. This is the muscular system, and this is muscle groups of the upper body. This is a pretty long lecture. So the best way I can explain is to jump right in, and then I would use multiple ways to try to get this material done. So learning strategy, models. When you're looking at models, you're memorizing this in lab. This is the reason why you have A&P lab. You need to look at these muscle groups. You need to kind of memorize. You need to kind of see where they are on the models, because then you can understand the whole terms of agonist, antagonist, synergist. Because if you see where they are on the model, you see the bones they're connected to, then you understand origin and insertion. Then you can do action, and a lot of these other things that become very difficult for students to get, they kind of fall into place. Next, some of you, studying a cadaver is the best way to go. In some universities, they dissect cats and other animals to look at muscle groups. And you might think that's a little overkill, but when you're studying muscles and you're going to go into nursing or kinesthesiology or other types of things, or even medical school, when you're looking at a muscle, the best way to know what muscle is to look at the fibers. You might think that memorizing origin and then its insertion is too much, but by memorizing origin and insertion, you know where a muscle is coming from and where it's going to. And if you're looking at that muscle on a dissected animal or a human, then you have to pay attention to those muscle fibers and the direction those fibers are running. Also, photographic atlas, you can look at a book. You can go on Amazon and you can look at many photographic atlases for muscles or bones or whatever muscle group or whatever group you want, and you can get a visual image of all the muscles. Also, you can check your phone. If you have an Android or if you have an iPhone, just like for the bones, you can download an app that you can use it to play games, to see how well you are at locating muscle groups and muscles. You can also do a game and say, hey, I want to play with a friend. I want to compete against them. You can have your friend download the same app, and then you can see who can get the best scores. And if you do it that way, memorizing this stuff becomes a little more fun, and I try to emphasize a little more because this will take a lot of time. This will take a lot of effort on your part. Also, when you're studying a particular muscle, you will be able to palpate that on yourself. So you can touch your arm, your leg, or wherever the muscle is, your back, your shoulder, and then if that muscle contracts, it'll tighten. And by having it tighten, having you actually feeling it, and then knowing the origin and insertion while you're studying it, will give you a better memory and more emotional connection to where that muscle is on your body. And if you have that little connection, you're more likely to memorize it for the test. Also, you can look at the origins and insertions of the muscles on an articulated skeleton. Those are those skeletons in the lab, in the library, and the Student Learning Center that have the red and the blue colors on them. The red and the blue are going to be the origins and insertions, and what you can do with that articulated skeleton is just move those two areas closer together, and once you do that, you will see the bones of the skeleton move, and that's the action of that particular muscle. Because again, a muscle is just going to contract. Another thing, say the names out loud to yourself or study partner. Then try to spell them correctly. I know that sounds very weird. If you're in a lab class that you have to spell these words out, it becomes very challenging and very scary for some students to actually write these words down because the lettering is kind of weird. The words are probably foreign to you. So please try when you're first doing this to just take your time and make sure you use every possible thing to help you study. So getting started, facial expression, you have the frontalis on top, the orbicularis around the eye, you have the zygomaticus minor, zygomaticus major, you have the orbicularis oris, the buccinator is right there, and the masseter is right there. You also have a tendon sheath on top called the galea aponeurotica. And if you've gotten past this slide and you're like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a very boring lecture. You're right, it is. It's me pointing out what's in red. This is why I would normally tell students, if it's in a class, let's break up into groups. Let's start looking at pictures. If you're in the lab, let's start pulling out the actual models and pointing to these structures. So on top of the head, you'll see the Galea aponeurotica. And even if you turn the head to the side, you can still see the Galea aponeurotica. You still see the frontalis, the orbicularis oculi. You still have the zygomaticus minor and zygomaticus major. On this diagram or cartoon, you see the major is a little bit longer than the minor. In some of the models in the lab class, that's not necessarily the case. So it's best to say the minor is going to be medial, the major is going to be lateral. Then you can see the orbicularis oris, the buccinator, the masseter. Now you can bring in the sternocleidomastoid of the neck and the occipitalis in the back. So it's very important to not just listen to me say these, but go to the SLC. Spend extra time in your lab class so you know where all of these are located. Because I can do a question like, which muscle is not on the front of the face? And all I do is I just do, that's A, B, C, masseter's not on the front of the face, but it is on the face. So if you don't know where these, if you don't know by the name where it's located, then you might get that question wrong on the test. Another thing, when you're studying the frontalis, touch your forehead. Temporalis, side of your head. So when you see the word temporalis, you know you're touching the side of your head. So that's why it's important to not just look at the words, but please try to have some type of connection to where that muscle is on the body. You have many different muscles for chewing and swallowing. None of them are in red on this particular slide. Because the tongue is very agile, it needs to push food around, it needs to chew, push it into the molars for chewing, it needs to swallow with the pharynx. It's very important for speech by moving the tongue around and having low and high pitched and louder. It's very, very important to have a bunch of muscles that help out with the tongue. You have, not just with the tongue, one of the more important one is chewing. And because these are bigger, I'm going to spend more time on chewing. We already talked about temporalis and the masseter, and because we've already talked about those are the two main ones we're going to look at with chewing. We're not going to look at the media and lateral pterygoids. Those are going to be on the inside, but we're looking at the two main ones on the outside. And that helps to open the mouth or close the mouth. And by protraction and retraction, you can grind the actual food. But if you look at the temporalis, you look at the masseter, it's just going to be used to closing the mouth. Also, you have other muscles there. You have the hyoid muscles and the suprahyoid group. You have the digastric, the glenohyoid, the mylohyoid, and the stylohyoid. And you're like, wow, those are all weird. Styloid process to hyoid. So you start looking at these, they do actually start making sense. But all of those are going to be muscles found in the neck. You also have the omohyoid, sterohyoid, and thyrohyoid, and sternohyoid. And you can see how all of them right in here in the neck, they're very small. And that's why speech, chewing, swallowing, there's many small muscles in the neck. But the main one we're going to be looking at that you should memorize is sternocleidomastoid. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, or the beginning of part 1, we're only going to be looking at about 50 muscles. And remember, you have about 600. So there's going to be a lot of them that I'm not going to make you memorize. So muscles acting on the head. You can tip the head forward, that's flexion. And if you remember the muscle, what you're doing with the action, flexion is going to be decreasing in angle. Extension is going to be increasing in angle. You can laterally flex something, tipping the head to one side, and that's just moving the head to one side, decreasing an angle, or you can rotate it from left to right. Sternocleidomastoid again is going to flex the neck. The scalenes also flex the neck. You also have extenders called the trapezius. The trapezius is going to be a neck and back muscle, and it's neck and back because it starts up here, goes all the way here, and then goes all the way down to T12. That's the trapezius. We'll look at it again when we look at the back. Some may cause contralateral movement, and that's just movement of the head towards the opposite side, and that's moving it to the left or moving it to the right. And you can have ipsilateral movement, which is moving the head to the same side. Of the trunk, you have three functional groups: respiration, muscles that support the abdominal wall and the pelvic floor, and then vertebral column. Let's first look at respiration. And because breathing is extremely important, the diaphragm is an extremely important muscle. The diaphragm is the main muscle for breathing. So the diaphragm is the one that if you don't memorize this, you will get a couple questions wrong on the exam. So the diaphragm, external intercostals, internal intercostals, and just look at the word. External means on the outside. Costal cartilage is going to be on the ribs, so these are on the outside. These allow the ribs, when they contract, when the muscle contracts, they allow the ribs to go out. These bring the ribs back in. So take a second or two and take a deep breath. Take that deep breath, and when you see your ribs go out, those are the muscles bringing the ribs out. When you exhale a lot, you see the ribs being contracted and going back into your body. Those are going to be the internal intercostals. And inspiration, which we'll talk about when we do respiration, is breathing air in. Expiration is expelling the air. You have other muscles, sternocleidomastoids and scalenes of the neck. They're also going to try to contribute to breathing. Sternocleidomastoid can actually raise and give more space for your lungs to move up where your clavicle bone is. You have the pectoralis major, which actually the main movement is movement of the arm, but the pectoralis major also allows you to bring and puff out your chest. The serratus anterior, that's the one where you throw a punch. So if you're throwing a punch, that serratus anterior, that serrated looking muscle that's on the front, that's the main one for throwing a punch, but also they're minor helpers with respiration. Latissimus dorsi, which is on the back, it's going to be on the other side of your chest, but the latissimus dorsi is also going to be able to have everything be stable. Internal and abdominal obliques and the transverse abdominis are all going to help out with breathing. Diaphragm, like I said, the main muscle for respiration. You might have memorized in a lab class or another class that you might have had in the past, the cervical nerves that innervate the diaphragm is C345. So the mnemonic is C345 keeps you alive. And if you look at the diaphragm muscle, it goes all the way up to your ribs, bottom part of your ribs. So you can see all those ribs. Rib 12 is all the way down here. It attaches all the way in the back to your vertebral column. And what it does when it contracts, it brings this area down to this area, and it expands the area within your thoracic cavity. And what it does when it expands the area in your thoracic cavity, it allows a lower pressure for the lungs, and that is what causes air to move from a higher pressure on the outside of your body to the lower pressure on the inside of the body. And that contraction flattens the diaphragm and enlarges the thoracic cavity. By enlarging a volume, you lower the pressure, and that's how you breathe. Also, when you relax it, it shrinks the thoracic cavity, increases the pressure in that space, and that's what forces air back out. The external intercostals are going to be on the outside. They bring the ribs up. The internal on the inside, bring them back in, and that also allows you to breathe deeper. The internal abdominal oblique is going to be on the inside. The external abdominal oblique is on the outside, but the way you kind of think about it is, I mentioned when you do cadaver dissections, you're looking at muscle fibers. The internal abdominal oblique, the muscle fibers run from the midline to your iliac crest. The external abdominal oblique runs from the outside to the middle. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, put your hands in your pocket. Look at your fingers. Your fingers are going to be the muscle fibers going into your pocket. So if the muscle fibers are pointing this way, it's external oblique. If you take your left hand, try to put it into your right pocket, the fingers are going this way, and if the fingers are going opposite, the fingers look like your muscle fibers of the internal oblique. So if this finger is going into this pocket, the muscle fibers are running here. That'll be external oblique fibers. If you take this arm and move it over here, the muscle fibers are now going this direction. It's internal oblique. Then you have the transverse abdominis. The transverse abdominis is kind of like your belt, where it's just going across. So transverse abdominis is going across. If you see fibers that run directly across your abdomen, that has to be your transverse abdominis. You see people in the gym where they're just kind of going back and forth with a medicine ball and just rotating their trunk. What they're doing is they're using their transverse abdominis. To use an oblique muscle, obliques, by the name, they go at an angle. So you either have to move in a certain angle of those muscle fibers for you to get the most out of each muscle movement. Rectus abdominis, your ab muscles. Most people know what this is. They strive for a six-pack, but what they are, they're all the way attached to your sternum and your pubic symphysis. And what they do is they shorten this area. So if you're doing crunches and stuff, you are going to be working out your rectus abdominis. Then the latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi attaches into the humerus. So by bringing your arm down, this is going to be contracting the latissimus dorsi. And then up here I mentioned that it's a neck and back muscle, trapezius, because it goes all the way down to T12, all the way up there to cervical vertebrae and the occipital bone. You can see how large that area is of the trapezius. The erector spinae. The erector spinae, just like the name says, it's actually a group of a couple muscles, but the erector spinae erects the spine. And the different types of muscles that are there, that are all these right there of the erector spinae, these two, because they run parallel to the spine, if you're going to stand up straight, you're going to be using the erector spinae muscles to actually stand up straight, because it's the spine that's going to become erect. Now, some of you might have heard of the term hernia. A hernia is a condition in which viscera protrudes through a weak point in the muscular wall of the abdominal pelvic cavity. You can have an inguinal hernia, which is down here. You can have a hiatal or an umbilical hernia, and umbilical hernias are very common with babies. So let's look at this. The inguinal hernia is the most common hernia. They say it's rare in women, but if you work in a hospital long enough, you see it in male and female. But what happens is in males, when the testes descend, they go along the iliac crest when the gonads are going to descend, and then they go through this inguinal canal and through and drop down into the scrotum. The problem with that is when the testes goes through the inguinal canal and passes through that membrane, there's a little weakness there. So part of your intestines, you can see part of the small intestines right there, going through the inguinal canal, creating a hernia. Hiatal hernia is where stomach protrudes through the diaphragm into the thorax. And umbilical is where visceral protrudes through the navel, through that umbilical, where the umbilical cord was. And like I said, umbilical hernia, you do see this in children if they cry a lot. They might have discomfort and other things, but because the umbilical cord might not have completely healed, that's pretty much your belly button. Stuff can actually protrude through there, and then they'll have to go back up and sew that area up so stuff will not protrude through the navel. So now let's look at the shoulder and the upper limb. You have a couple different compartments where muscles are organized and separated by the fibrous connective tissue. And the way we're actually going to look at this, I'm not going to teach you the different parts or compartments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the different names of muscles and then have you go through them and then see if you can find them on the model. Once you find them on the model, can you find them on yourself? If you can find them on yourself, you can say, wow, my elbow hurts, my wrist hurts. Then you can be able to think about how each individual muscle in these different groups are broken down into different compartments. So instead of going over compartment syndrome of one muscle or blood vessel in a compartment is injured, I'm going to go over if certain parts of your body is injured, what's the action? If you know the action and then you know what's hurting, you know what muscle is going to be injured. So we're not going to do the arms and the legs, but what we're going to do is just kind of go over. There's not a lot of room for muscles and a lot of room for blood vessels and nerves. So if you hit your elbow and it's really, really hurt and you said, oh, I hit my funny bone, after this you're going to say, oh, I hit a nerve. And hopefully by the end of the upper arm, you'll be able to figure out what nerve did you injure. Also, one more thing about compartment syndrome. Some of you might have fallen asleep on your arm and you feel like it's dead, because if you have poor blood flow that persists for more than 2 to 4 hours, nerves begin to die. That's why most of the time when you're laying on your arm might be on top of you and you pinch different blood supply, and then that blood supply doesn't go all the way to the muscles, it can start feeling dead. So when you wake up, you get that tingling sensation, and that's what happens when the blood supply starts going back to those different types of muscles and nerves. So let's look at the shoulder and the upper limb. The upper limb is used for a broad range of powerful and subtle actions: climbing, grasping, throwing, writing, playing musical instruments, manipulating small objects. You're going to have muscles that act on the scapula, humerus, and then the shoulder joint. What does it mean to call something a rotator cuff muscle? And then what are the muscles on the forearm and then the elbow joint? So the ones on the shoulder, they originate on the axial skeleton or on the vertebrae or the skull. They insert onto the clavicle or the scapula. You might have heard clavicle and scapula. I think the clavicle would be sternocleidomastoid and other stuff. And then you can start seeing how axial skeleton will then go to the appendicular skeleton. The scapula, because of the way it's shaped, is capable of very large movements. It can rotate, it can elevate, it can depress, it can protract, it can retract. So it has a lot of ways it can move. And the clavicle is going to brace the shoulder and then moderate its movement into certain directions. So lateral rotate, elevation, depression, medial rotation, protraction forward, retraction back. And if you remembered those definitions of all those exercises, you know exactly how you would be able to do these different types of movements. Now let's look at some muscles. So first, serratus anterior, we already mentioned. Serratus anterior is on the front, ribs 1 to 9 to the medial border of the scapula. They abducts and rotates or depress the scapula. Then you have the trapezius, which we already talked about, on the back. And the trapezius stabilizes the scapula and shoulder. It can elevate it if the fibers up here go up. It can depress it at the apex because you can see it's going to be below it. So the muscle fibers down here contract, it's going to lower it or depress it. You also have the pectoralis major, which we talked about. That's going to be on the front. It's all the way connected to the sternum. and it's going to the humerus. It can flex, abduct, and medially rotate the humerus, and the latissimus dorsi is on the back, also attaching to the humerus. It adducts and medially rotates the humerus. You have the deltoid. The deltoid's an interesting one on your shoulder because it goes on the front, the side, and the back. It can rotate and abduct the arm. It can bring the arm forward, bring it backwards because of the large spread of muscle fibers it has. You also have the teres major. The teres major is just below the teres minor. The teres major goes to the humerus. The teres minor goes to the head of the humerus. So the teres minor is going to be considered rotator cuff because all rotator cuff muscles go to the head of the humerus. Teres major, because it attaches to just below the head of the humerus, it's not considered rotator cuff. But it does extension in medially rotation of the humerus. Like I mentioned, rotator cuff, all of these muscles go to the head of the humerus. And because the humerus doesn't have something like the acetabulum in the hip, where it kind of forms a whole capsule, the rotator cuff muscles are what actually holds your humerus into the glenoid cavity. And the acronym SITS is for supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. And it's because all of these go to the head of the humerus. Supraspinatus is in the supraspinous fossa. Infraspinatus is in the infraspinous fossa. Subscapularis is in the subscapular fossa. So if you knew the fossas on the scapula, your rotator cuff muscles are extremely, extremely easy. And here's where they are. Above the spine is your supraspinatus. Below the spine is infra. There's your teres minor and your subscapularis. And you can see how they all wrap around. If the humerus was there, they wrap around the head of the humerus and make sure the head of the humerus stays into the glenoid cavity. Going down, we're now going to have the principal elbow flexors in the anterior compartment, so the ones on the front. Biceps brachii is on top, brachialis is just below it. Brachialis is produces 50% more power than the biceps brachii. So you see somebody in the gym doing a biceps curl. What they're really doing is they're using their brachialis and they're just pushing up their biceps brachii to make the biceps brachii look bigger. But it's because the brachialis is the bigger muscle for that flexion. And then the extensor on the back is going to be the triceps brachii. And that's the prime mover for elbow extension. Now we're in the forearm. The brachioradialis flexes the elbow. It goes from the brachius and inserts into the radial bone, or radius. You also have the pronator teres. Pronator teres, because of it says pronate, it pronates the arm. Supinator is going to supinate the arm. And here you can see the brachialis is just going to be underneath the biceps brachii. Triceps will be on the back. Triceps, that's the posterior view. There's the biceps on top, and it's biceps because it has two heads. I'm not going to require you to memorize that it has two heads or where are the three heads of the triceps. That's not that important for this lab. Here you can see the supinator that supinates, the pronator teres that pronates. So pronate is palm down, supination is palm up. Then you have muscles acting on the forearm, intrinsic, extrinsic muscles, and what you do is you're pretty much moving your hand. Are you moving your wrist? Are you moving your thumb? And these are the muscles that are going to be doing that. Flexor carpi radialis. Flexor flexes the wrist at the radial bone. And if you look, you have a thumb and a pinky. If you kind of move your hand, your thumb's going to be moving the most. So the thumb side is going to be the radius, pinky side is going to be the ulna bone. Another way to think about it, you can rate things with your thumb. So flexor carpi radialis, flexor is going to be on the palm because it decreases in angle. Carpal bones is on the wrist, and it's going to be on the thumb side. Flexor digitorum, this is going to flex the digits. so it's going down the middle to the palm. Flexor carpi ulnaris is also going to be on the front, going to the carpal bone, and starts on the ulna bone. So it's pinky side. And then you have the palmaris longus, which we'll show you on the next slide. So you have, these are all the extensors. So this is the back of the hand. So if you saw the back of the hand, it's just the opposite. When you're going over in lecture or lab, please make sure you look at models for this because it's much easier to kind of see. Extensor carpi radialis longus extenses the wrist on the radius side. Extensor digitorum extends the digits on the back of the hand. Extensor back, because it's going to extend or increase in angle, the wrist on the ulna side. One thing to kind of think about it, we talked about the flexor reticulum and carpal tunnel when we talked about how tendon sheaths kind of, wrap around muscle and tendons. So the flexor reticulum is a bracelet-like fibrous sheath which the flexor tendons of the extrinsic muscles that flex the wrist, that means the ones on the front, pass on their way to their insertions. So this wraps around all of those flexor muscles. What happens with carpal tunnel is when you're resting your wrist on something, you're actually inhibiting the flexor reticulum and the movement, the free movement of all those flexor tendons. And if you decrease the space that's already tight, it'll then cause rubbing of these tendons when you move your fingers. And what happens, you can start having nerve pain that goes all the way back into your elbow, eventually all the way back up into your shoulder, and even worse. So when the flexor tendons passing through the tunnel are enclosed in tendon sheath, it enables tendons to slide back and forth quite easily. But if you're putting prolonged repetitive motions of the wrist and fingers, and then you put pain on top of them, where you put pressure, where you're resting your wrist onto like a hard desk or the corner of a wooden, desk or something like that, that will cause the flexor reticulum and then those tendons to become inflamed, swollen, and fibrotic. They become fibrotic. Scar tissue will start to form on them, and then every time you move your fingers, it'll become painful. It might start with some kind of discomfort or tingling, but eventually the pain might radiate to the arm or the shoulder. You can have anti-inflammatory drugs. You can start putting on wrist guards and stuff like that that stop the movement of the wrist, and sometimes surgery that then will remove part or all of the flexor reticulum to relieve that pressure. So because most people in their lives, you're probably wondering, why do I have that little gel thing that sits right in front of my keyboard at work? The reason you have that is to try to have a cushion for your wrist where that flexor reticulum is, so you don't get carpal tunnel. And here you can kind of see how everything is. You can see your flexor reticulum right there, and then you can see those flexor tendons going into the wrist. So on the front of your hand, the palm side, all that repetitive motion will cause inflammation and pressure on the median nerve. That median nerve then goes back up to your arm, and that median nerve, middle, is going back up to your arm, and then that's that pain sensation you feel in carpal tunnel. And those are all the muscles of the upper part of your body. Again, please don't listen to this and think that this is all the learning you need to do. Please learn models. Please start to go over the lecture notes again. Try to figure out where these muscles are on your body. And then once you know where they are on your body, try to start studying with friends in the SLC or the library to try to make sure you know everything and you're 100% before you get ready for the exam. Good luck.